Thank you so much. It was a very short break, so please welcome Congressman Jerry Nadler.
Well, thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking Inspire New York and Chris for inviting me. Let me say a number of things. You probably know some things about me. You probably know that I impeached Trump, that I led the impeachment of Trump twice, that I've led the fight against guns in Congress, that I've led the fight for women's rights and for abortion and for LGBTQ rights. What you may not know about me is my role in the Second Avenue subway back in 2005 when Carolyn came to me as a member of the Transportation Committee, that is I was, and asked me to get funds for the Second Avenue subway. I did it in 2005 and again in 2010 and again in 2015 and again in 2020 because we have 5-year reauthorizations for transportation funding. You may not know that of my role in the 9/11 first responders, but I was the first to say when Mayor Giuliani and Chrissy Todd Whitman, the head of the EPA, were saying that the air was safe to breathe, I was saying, no, it's not safe to breathe. It is not safe to breathe. And even though they want to get Wall Street reopened, it's not right to do that at the expense of people who, if they go back to work now or go back to their apartments, are going to get sick. And then, when predictably they started getting sick, I worked to pass the bill and we finally did, to pass the bill to provide compensation for the 9/11 survivors. And we passed it back in 2010. It was called the Zadroga Act. And we had to renew it in 2015, and we had to renew funding for it a few years after that. You may also not know that I am an original co-sponsor, that is to say one of the 3 or 4 people who originally introduced the Green New Deal to deal with climate change into Congress. With respect to New York specifically, you may not know that I have led the fight against the noisy helicopters and that I've stood up to wannabe despots all over the world. So that's, I think that's my introduction, and I'll ask the questions.
Thank you so much. So I want to start with 2 of the same issues that we talked about with Congresswoman. One being January 6th. Obviously, we all followed the impeachment hearings closely, and a lot of people were really disappointed to see the acquittals in the Senate. And now we're seeing this glimmer of hope that there could be some accountability. But a lot of people are concerned that the committee, despite presenting a lot of evidence, we're not sure. Is there going to be a criminal referral? How is the Attorney General going to handle this? What are your thoughts on how the committee should proceed, and what are your thoughts on the Biden administration's response thus far?
Well, as I said, I led the 2 impeachments in the first place. I was obviously very disappointed that the Senate, despite what I thought was ironclad evidence, refused to convict, rather. I'm disappointed in the Biden administration right now. I don't think they've reacted with nearly the energy they should. I think that the 9/11 Commission probably will make a criminal referral. Certainly the evidence they're piling up so far indicates that. And also keep your eye on Georgia, because the Georgia Attorney General is bringing indictments on you remember President Trump's famous call to Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, just find me 11,780 votes. Well, that was a crime, obviously. That was a crime of seditious conspiracy, of conspiring to obstruct government administration. And the DA in Fulton County, which is to say Atlanta, is prosecuting. And so I believe that Trump is probably going to be prosecuted by the DA in Georgia, if not by the Justice Department, although the Justice Department certainly should.
And on the same subject of Trump's influence or attempted influence over the vote, another question I asked prior, I'd like to get your perspective on the ongoing threat to democracy in 2024. But the Republican Party in many states is attempting to install people in positions of power around elections who have made it pretty clear that they believe in conspiracy theories. And in addition to that, there's a concern that the Supreme Court is going to recognize a new legal theory of sorts that would essentially strip the meaning of our vote away by allowing state legislatures to send whatever electors they want to the Electoral College. What can we do?
That's the independent state legislatures theory, which was considered a fringe doctrine and is now, with this Supreme Court, not considered a fringe doctrine. And it's not only this issue. There are other issues with the Supreme Court. The logic of the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade leads inexorably, although Alito said it wouldn't, Justice Thomas gave the game away and said in so many words, it leads inexorably to reversing the 1965 decision in Griswold permitting birth control. It leads inexorably to reversing the ban on consensual sodomy, which was the Lawrence case in 2003. It leads inexorably, although Thomas didn't mention this, to reversing Loving, which found state laws against interracial marriage to be illegal. Obviously, Justice Thomas had a reason for not mentioning that because he's in an interracial marriage, but it's the same logic. And if they go down that road that he wants to go down, that's where they're going to end. So, and the same is true with election administration. We have to deal with the Supreme Court. And by the way, in the climate decision, where they overthrew the climate, the doctrine that they used to overturn the climate regulation by the EPA was that Congress cannot, essentially what's called the non-delegability doctrine. Congress cannot delegate decisions to administrative agencies that it must make. Now, in modern times, that means that Congress has to decide what percentage, 0.69% of ozone in the air is okay, but 0.70 is not. Congress cannot possibly make such decisions on unforeseen questions. So the Supreme Court is headed down the road and of making things impossible for democracy to function, for women's rights, for gay rights, you name it. That's why, and it's a consequence of the deliberate packing of the court by McConnell when he refused to give Merrick Garland even a hearing because he said the new president, a year away, should select, and then rushing forward with Amy Coney Barrett a few days before the election. But this is the culmination of a drive by McConnell and the Federalist Society that goes back years to pack the federal judiciary. The only way to change this is a bill that I introduced along with two other members of Congress, and Senator Markey of Massachusetts, about a year ago, to counterpack the Supreme Court, to increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court by 4. That would give President Biden the ability to appoint 4 justices, I should say, and disempower the right-wing majority on the court right now. And I think that's the only way to do it. Now that was considered when Ed Markey and I introduced it, a very radical notion. The president still says he doesn't support it, but as the court keeps acting, as we see these increasing threats, people are getting more and more to see it. It's becoming thought of as less radical, and I think we have a very good chance of enacting it in the next couple of years, provided we get 2 more Democratic senators. And then we can abolish the filibuster. And you know, people think the filibuster is some ancient rule. The filibuster was invented by John C. Calhoun to defend slavery. It was used by the old Southern racist Democrats to defend Jim Crow. But people got used to it. But the US Senate is the only legislative body in the democratic world. That means the House of Representatives, it means every state legislative chamber, it means the Knesset, the Bundestag, the Riksdag, the parliaments of all the different countries, you name it. It's the only legislative chamber in the world, in a democratic country, that doesn't have the motion on the previous question whereas the majority can end debate and go to a vote. And that enshrines minority rule. And in fact, Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers back in 1789 against this. So it's about time we did something about it.
I'm really curious to get your perspective on the question of impeachment of Supreme Court justices. What are your thoughts on whether any of the current sitting justices should be impeached and whether that's an appropriate remedy?
I think it'd be very difficult to impeach. I mean, some people have said that Kavanaugh and Gorsuch should be impeached because of what they said about precedent in the Senate hearings and the fact that they overruled Roe v. Wade. I don't think you can do that. There are precedents that have been overturned before, Plessy versus Ferguson, others, and they said that they had a high regard for precedent. It doesn't mean you can't overrule it. I think you're wrong to overrule it, obviously, but I don't think you can impeach them for it. That's why you just have to outvote them by counterpacking the court.
And you seem very optimistic about the possibility of counterpacking the court, because what I'm hearing from you is that if we add 2 Senate Democrats who are, approve of abolishing the filibuster, you think Biden is going to support this change, even though he's been pretty?
I think he'll come to, because as time goes on, this Supreme Court is going to stop everything he wants.
Yeah.
And he's gonna realize that there's no choice.
And going back to something you said earlier about the EPA, you expressed, Congress simply can't do the job that the court has assigned it through its finding. But I mean, we're in a bit of a catch-22 because now the Congress has to. So what can the Congress do?
That is the problem. Congress will try to do it, will try to pass it, but you can't anticipate every specific. When somebody comes up with wants to open a new power plant, and it's going to increase ozone by 0.003, is that sufficient, or is it 0.004? Congress can't make those decisions. It's just not equipped. That's why we have regulatory agencies. That's why Congress empowered the regulatory agencies. And the Supreme Court, by making this decision, has essentially made it impossible. And they want to deconstruct the administrative state. That's what Steve Bannon said. Deconstruct the administrative state. And that would leave us all much worse off. That will leave us all much worse off. And I come back to the Supreme Court.
It's a frightening notion. I think something that we both agree that Congress does have a role to play would be the issue of guns. And
yes.
As I asked the Congresswoman, what more do you believe we can do to ensure safety in schools? Because a lot of people looked at the gun bill that just passed and went, yeah, everything in it's all right, but this is not what we're looking for.
Well, as chairman of Judiciary, I have led the fight on guns, and not just in schools. Because guns, there are mass murders, not just in schools. And there are more people killed, not in mass murders. Mass murder is defined as where 4 people are killed at once. There are many more people killed all the time. And the Republicans blame mental health. That's a slander. The American people are not 40 times as mentally ill as people in other advanced countries. And what we can do is get weapons of war off our streets. Now, one thing is to pass the assault weapons ban that was in effect from 1994. It was in effect from 1994 to 2004. In 2004, we had a Republican Congress and a Republican president. They permitted it to lapse. We have to reenact it, and I've introduced legislation to do that. We passed it through the committee and through the House. The second thing we have to do is, in 2005, the Republican Congress and President Bush passed a law that is unique, and that um, 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 says that a gun company cannot be sued and cannot be held liable for any damage done as a result of its conduct. Nobody else has that protection. If you manufacture a washing machine that electrocutes somebody or that malfunctions, you can be sued, but not gun manufacturers. They're the only people who have that that immunity, and we ought to repeal this. We ought to repeal that. We passed through our committee and through the House bills to ban magazines of more than 15 rounds, so you'd have to reload. To ban bump stocks. Bump stocks are something you put onto a rifle and it turns it into a machine gun. To say that 18 to 21-year-olds cannot own assault rifles or weapons of any kind other than simple handguns or rifles for shooting deer, that sort of thing. We passed legislation to close the loopholes, to say that, well, the current law is that if you're a gun show owner, you have to register sales to an individual. But if you buy 30 guns from the gun show owner and sell them to someone else, you don't have to register that at all. So we have a bill, we've passed a bill to change that. So we've passed bills in the House under my leadership, all of them under, to deal with the gun problem. What the Senate passed was a pay limitation. And what they passed, we then passed. And I thought, well, I'm just using the following numbers for illustration because I don't know what the number is. If our bills would save 100,000 lives, and what the Senate passed would save 10,000, I'll take the 10,000. So we passed the Senate bill. But we should pass, the Senate should pass what we did.
I hear a lot of frustration from you about what we see from the Senate, and something that I asked the Congresswoman was, 93% of Americans say they don't have a high degree of faith in Congress, a high degree of trust. Only 7% do. Part of the reason that we're seeing some of this Democratic backsliding is in fact because there are a number of Americans who are less convinced of the value of democracy when they just see it not working. How do you restore, as a member of Congress, how do you restore that trust in an institution in which the vast majority of the American people don't believe is working?
By making it work. People see that we're not dealing with the issues, with the problems. The truth is, because of the Republicans in the Senate, and because of 2 Democrats who won't vote to suspend or eliminate the filibuster, we aren't dealing with those problems. But give us 2 more Democrats who will vote against the filibuster, and we can then deal with these problems. And if you deal with these problems, then confidence in Congress will go up. But of course, you're not going to have confidence in Congress when Congress doesn't deal with our problems and doesn't do anything adequate. Now, we've done some things. We've passed legislation to, in the American Rescue Plan, in the infrastructure plan, we did pass legislation for infrastructure. We passed legislation for child care tax credits, but that expires. And we have an extension that we're trying to get through, but that's blocked by the Senate. So it's not true to say that we haven't done anything, but what we have done is grossly inadequate to the problems of the country, and that's what people are reacting to. And the answer is, act so people see that you're acting. Act so we really start solving these problems. And that takes, people don't distinguish between, well, they just look and say, well, you got a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president, and nothing gets done. They don't think about the filibuster, they don't think about anything. All they see is total frustration. All they see, or they have total frustration. We have to get the votes to start acting so that things do get solved, and then people won't have a lack of faith in Congress and in democracy, frankly.
And something that I found interesting is that when we asked the residents here for questions, I expected a lot of the questions to be specifically about seniors, but a lot of the questions were about grandkids. The fear for what's coming next. And one question I asked the Congresswoman that I'd be curious to get your take on is the coordinated attack by Republicans on transgender and LGBTQ youth. We're seeing bills that are specifically targeting children and their families. What can the Congress do to prevent this abuse across the country?
Well, we have a bill called the Equality Act, which I'm a co-sponsor of, along with David Cicilline of Rhode Island, who is chairman of the Equality Caucus. And this would specifically guarantee LGBTQ rights and would guarantee trans rights. A number of years ago, in fact, because I was very conscious of trans rights, I voted in 2006 or 7 against an ENDA, a fair employment bill for gays, for gay people, because it didn't include transgender rights. And I was only one of 7 people who did that. There were only 7 of us, who, not including anybody else sitting in this room, who were conscious of the transgender need at the time.
And do you see any risk right now that some of the rights that we've enshrined for LGBTQ people that we know that one justice on the Supreme Court made a concurrent opinion that had this level of attack. Do you believe that rights like the right to sexual privacy and marriage equality are actually at risk over the coming year? And if so, what should we be doing?
I don't know over the coming year, but in the near future, yes. They're very much at risk. We held a hearing in my committee the other day. Mr. Obergefell was there. He was the lead plaintiff in the Obergefell case, which along with the Windsor case established the right to gay marriage. I, by the way, wrote the congressional amicus briefs in both those cases. Yes, there was a direct threat, and Justice Thomas laid it out. Justice Thomas laid it out. The substantive due process argument that the court used to overturn Roe v. Wade applies equally, as Justice Thomas pointed out, to gay rights, to contraception, to personal autonomy, and to interracial marriage, though he didn't point that out. So yes, I think there's a very direct threat. And that threat can be overcome, frankly, by a different Supreme Court, which comes back to my proposal to increase the court by 4. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do about it. And by the way, there's another threat. You see state after state, many states, passing anti-abortion laws and trying to criminalize people crossing the borders of their state to another state. We just passed a bill in the House today's Saturday? Yesterday. No, Thursday.
Don't ask me what day it is, I've lost track.
This week.
Yesterday.
Yes.
We passed it yesterday.
We passed the bill to guarantee the right to travel. But the Supreme Court could overturn that. The Supreme Court could overturn that, and might very well. And again, you come back to, we need a different Supreme Court, and my bill and Ed Markey's bill to unpack the court.
Thank you. I'd like to stick with healthcare for a couple of questions. The question that I asked the Congresswoman, which I very much took her point about pain relief in older adults. The Congresswoman brought up the risk of opiate addiction and death, and that's something that touched my family. I lost somebody I was close to opioid overdose. How do we address issues like chronic pain and people who are living a lot longer, and how do we get access to pain relief without also creating another problem where we cause harm?
We have to prosecute people like the Sacklers who deliberately promote opioids beyond the necessity for pain. You need opioids for pain relief, or at least some patients do. Others can do with other drugs. I'm not a doctor, but clearly opioids are necessary for many patients. But there are people, the manufacturers who have, or some of the manufacturers, not all of them, but certainly the Sacklers, for example, who have deliberately oversold this, and they must be prosecuted, and they are being prosecuted. And by the way, as long as we're on the subject of medical thing, we should pass the Medicare for All bill, which was originally, I've been a co-sponsor of since I arrived in Congress in 1993, because that will relieve everybody's medical financing problems.
We've been talking about Medicare for All for many, many years. Why do you think this has been such a hurdle?
Because, for one thing, the Republicans are ideologically opposed, just as they were to Social Security, as they were to Medicare. You may recall that Ronald Reagan first got famous by going on TV as a pitchman against Medicare, which hadn't passed yet. They're opposed to any government involvement, basically, in healthcare, and that's the main reason. And we just haven't, and Medicare for All is considered a radical idea by some Democrats too.
The president is not in favor of it.
I don't know where the president is, but he's not in favor of ending the filibuster at this point. He wants to suspend it, and he's not in favor of unpacking the Supreme Court. I think he'll change on that. I hope he'll change on the filibuster. But a lot of Democrats don't want to expand Medicare. They think it's expanded enough.
And another health-related question that I asked the Congresswoman was about the New York City has become the epicenter of the monkeypox, what appears to be becoming an additional epidemic in the United States, and we're seeing two dueling problems, which is a lack of vaccine access due to federal supply. We're just not getting them fast enough. And in addition to that, we're seeing inequity in distribution that matches what we've seen in previous vaccine rollouts with COVID. What can we do, both at the federal level and here in New York, to ensure that we are getting enough of this medication and that we are actually reaching at-risk communities?
Well, the first question is easier than the second.
Yes.
To ensure an adequate supply, the president should invoke the Defense Production Act, which enables the government to, this was enacted during World War II, and enables the government to commandeer any factory or any production facility and use it for something it deems necessary. So the president should invoke, and we don't need legislation for this. It's on the books. It's on the books since 1942. So the president should invoke the Defense Production Act and rapidly get a lot of factories working and increase the supply. That he can do. So that's not as long as he's willing to do it, that's not a problem.
That's a big question.
I know that, but some of us are pushing him to do that. He hasn't really responded yet, but he can do that. And I think he should do that. As I said, some of us are pushing for that. With respect to your second question, that's frankly harder. We have to try to get notice to minority groups in a way that they pay attention to. I mean, one of the problems is that a lot of poorer people don't have access to the internet, and it's harder to reach them. And unfortunately, people of color, a much higher percentage of them are low income and don't have access to the internet. So it's much harder to reach them. And we have to make extra effort, which we're not really doing, but we have to make extra effort not through the internet. We have to send people with leaflets. The old-fashioned way, go back to doing the way we did it in 1950.
Well, I'm having a great time with you. I'm getting the wrap it up signal from my point person over here, so I'd love to recognize you for a brief closing statement. I say 2 minutes, but clearly I don't enforce it. So.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation here. And
Of course.
thank you for your great questions. And I've been honored to represent Manhattan in Congress for 30 years. It's been a great honor. It still is. It's unfortunate that Carolyn and I were thrown together in the same district because we've worked together on certain issues. As I said, when she needed Second Avenue funding, she came to me and I got the Second Avenue funding. We worked together on the 9/11 responders legislation that became the Droga Act. After I was pointing out that it was not safe to return to work or to return to the apartments, and we predictably started getting very sick people, then we started working on the Zadroga Act. And I plan to continue for as long as I can to represent New York and to represent the liberal and progressive ideals that I think I've always championed. I think I'm recognized as one of the most effective and progressive members of the House. And I look forward to continuing that.
Thank you so much, Congressman.